In the depths of our genetic memory lie traces of an event that most people have never heard of. These are not wars of modern history, nor are they known empires that clashed in fierce battles. What happened was much earlier, at a time when people were just building the first villages, learning to grow grain and domesticate animals. And yet, at that time, something so brutal happened that the consequences were written directly into our genes. Events that changed the ratio of men to women so drastically that only a handful of the male population remained. What could have caused such extermination? How is it possible that this time has been written into the DNA, but has almost disappeared in the memory of mankind? The answers are dark, disturbing, and full of blood. Modern genetics allows us to read stories of the past directly from the cells of our body. Scientists examining the genome revealed that there was a massive reduction in genetic diversity on the male line during the late Neolithic period. The Y chromosome, passed down from father to son, was on the verge of extinction at that time. This phenomenon means that the male population has been exterminated to such an extent that barely 5% of the original number remains. The female genetic line did not experience such a drastic decline, suggesting that the cause must have been targeted, and targeted at men. Archaeogenetic evidence shows that this event occurred approximately 8,000 to 5,000 years ago and affected a wide area, from Europe and Asia to parts of Africa and the Middle East. This massacre was not a single swift attack, but a series of brutal clashes and prolonged violence that gradually wiped out the male population. More than 250 Neolithic sites have been found in Europe, where people died violently. Mass graves reveal the faces of those who have been victims. On the skeletons, there are traces of blows with blunt and sharp tools, arrow penetrations, and slashing wounds. Some sites, such as Germany's famous Talheim death pit, show horror in its purest form: 34 bodies buried together, with no signs of defensive injuries. Most of the victims suffered fatal wounds to the skull, suggesting executions or surprise ambushes. Young women were missing from the dead. They were most likely kidnapped and taken away. A similarly dark picture is painted at the Austrian site in Schletz, where the remains of 200 people were found. The dead were left unburied, often scattered around, indicating ruthlessness and contempt for the enemy. Here, too, young women were missing, and at the same time it was striking that there were few children among the dead. Everything points to the fact that the attackers carefully chose whom to kill and who to keep. The site of Herxheim in Germany is one of the most terrifying archaeological discoveries in Europe. In the period between 5,300 and 4,950 BC, the locals built dozens of pits just outside the walls of their village, which they filled with human remains. Over 1,000 individuals have been found here, ranging from newborns to old men, and estimates suggest that the final number may have reached as high as 1,500. The victims were systematically quartered, the skulls separated and often modified. Some of the bones bore traces of cooking or baking. Others were worked into the form of ornaments or weapons. Archaeologists believe that there may have been a religion or cult obsessed with skulls and human flesh. The Herxheim raids were so successful that people from long distances, even hundreds of kilometers away, became victims. Yet their settlement mysteriously disappeared within a few decades after these events. Historians and geneticists offer several explanations. One of the most widespread hypotheses connects the massacre with the Neolithic Revolution. The shift from hunting and gathering to agriculture led to the creation of permanent settlements, population growth, and stockpiling. This created new reasons for war. Food, land, and women were within reach, tempting them to raid the battlefield. In such an environment, it paid off to eliminate foreign men so that the attackers could seize their resources and families. Another theory speaks of a reorganization of society into patriarchal clans that did not accept foreign men, but women did. The war could easily have led to the disappearance of entire male lines, because there was no one to pass on the Y chromosome. Other researchers argue that smaller male groups were genetically weakened and were easy prey for stronger families. The common denominator of all these options, however, is violence. No theory can avoid it entirely. The weapons used by people during this period were not complicated, but they could do tremendous damage in the hands of experienced warriors. These tools were used not only for hunting, but also for fighting between people. The sharp side of the hoe could pierce a skull as easily as it could cut through the hard bark of a tree. A club or hammer could crush bones with a single blow, and arrows were deadly at long distances. Protection against these attacks was practically zero. Warriors usually wore only animal skin clothing or woven fabrics that provided no real defense against slash or stab wounds. The battles were therefore brutal and often ended in the massacre of the entire male population of the attacked settlement. Many sites suggest that death in Neolithic conflicts was not always instantaneous. In some places, skeletons were discovered that bore traces of broken bones, cutting off limbs, or beheading of heads. Some human remains have been deliberately modified and used as trophies, amulets, or warnings to enemies. In Asia at that time, the collection of heads was widespread, which was preserved in a similar way to how hunters expose antlers today. There is also evidence of cannibalism. Traces of cuts on the bones, missing body parts, and the method of heat treatment indicate that human flesh was not only a ritual symbol, but also food. The brain, rich in nutrients, could be considered a valuable part of the diet. The bones were crushed to extract the marrow, and the body parts were roasted or boiled. All this shows that victory often did not end with the mere killing of the enemy. It was followed by a long and perverse humiliation of his body. Life in the Neolithic was short and cruel. Life expectancy was between 20 and 33 years, with the high mortality rate being caused not only by disease and accidents, but above all, by violence. Getting into adulthood was an achievement because children often died in attacks or from injuries. Conflicts were so frequent that many people never knew a peaceful life without the threat of invaders. The high level of danger and the lack of effective medical care meant that even minor injuries could be fatal. Infections, blood loss, and lack of hygiene turned battles and small skirmishes into events with lasting consequences. War and everyday violence thus became an integral part of human existence, and the genetic trace of this period survives to this day. This brutal age did not stop because people suddenly found peace, but rather because population growth began to exceed mortality. New agricultural practices, the development of trade, and the emergence of more complex political structures have made it possible to gradually reduce the level of violence. There were still wars, but their impact on the overall survival of the population was no longer so drastic. Archaeological records indicate that it was only with the growth of organized societies that war became more regulated and less focused on the complete annihilation of the enemy. Yet the genetic consequences of the massacre that decimated the male population persist. Some regions still carry lower genetic diversity in the male line, an echo of a bloody chapter that almost erased entire families from history. Analysis of skeletal remains shows that in many conflicts, it was not the entire population that was killed, but rather specific groups on purpose. Most of them were adult and adolescent males, who represented a military force and a potential threat to the victors. This procedure had two main effects. It immediately weakened the defeated group's defenses, while ensuring that its women and children would be easily subjugated and integrated into the victor's society. This type of selective extermination is not unique in human history, but in the Neolithic it had an extreme impact on the genetic line of men. Each lost male line meant an interruption in the transmission of the Y chromosome, and in combination with repeated raids, this effect was multiplied. This is exactly what led to the sharp decline in genetic diversity that we see today in fossilized form in our genes. Young women were seen as valuable prey in many conflicts. Their abduction had a dual purpose. On the one hand, it served to expand the population of the victor, and on the other hand, it prevented the defeated tribe from regaining its strength. Archaeological finds from places such as Talheim and Schletz show a conspicuous absence of young women among the dead, strongly supporting this theory. The kidnappings were not just an isolated incident, but a systematic part of the war strategy. Women from different areas were often forcibly integrated into new communities, where both the reproductive and labor force played a role. Such practices have left lasting traces not only in the genetic composition of populations, but also in cultural traditions that have persisted for centuries. Some practices associated with violence were apparently also ritual or religious in nature. In Herxheim and other sites, skulls displayed on stakes, bones modified into ornaments and amulets, or human parts located in strategic places of settlements have been found. These findings suggest that the massacres may have been not only a military tactic, but also a way to maintain fear and obedience. Ritual violence may also have functioned as a means of uniting a community. All men of the tribe participated in the brutal acts, which strengthened the group identity and distinguished them from enemies. Such rituals were often accompanied by feasts, chants, and symbolic acts that gave the massacre a deeper meaning in the eyes of those who committed it. Even without today's technology, Neolithic communities were able to organize raids over distances of hundreds of kilometers. The attackers had to rely on foot movements, knowledge of the terrain, and careful planning. Before attacking, it was necessary to gather enough supplies, weapons, and men capable of fighting. The journey could take weeks and required perseverance and the ability to survive in hostile environments. Successful raids show that even then people understood the importance of tactics and coordination. Attacks often came at dawn or at night, when the enemy was most vulnerable. The invaders could combine direct combat with burning fields, stealing cattle, and destroying supplies, forcing the enemy to starve and surrender. Living in an environment where violence has become a daily threat has had a major impact on people's psyches. Growing up knowing that an attack could come at any time meant constant stress and vigilance. The fear of invaders shaped the behavior of the entire community, from the way they built their homes, to the fortifications of villages, to the social structure that favored the strongest and most experienced warriors. Children grew up in an atmosphere of constant threat, learning to use weapons from an early age and quickly learning survival tactics. Such a way of life may have encouraged the emergence of more cruel and cold-blooded warriors. Empathy for enemies was minimal, because killing was seen not only as a necessity, but also as a way to protect one's own people. Brutality thus became the norm, and its echoes could persist in cultural memory through generations. Today's knowledge of prehistoric massacres is not just a matter of chance, but the result of advanced archaeological techniques. The skeletal remains are examined using detailed osteological analysis, which can determine the type of injury, the direction of the blow, and the possible tools used. Radiocarbon dating can be used to more accurately determine the time of death and link individual events to broader cultural changes. Another method is isotope analysis, which determines the origin of an individual by the chemical composition of its teeth and bones. This makes it possible to determine whether the victims were from the local community or were foreigners. Together, these techniques create a mosaic of events that took place thousands of years ago and give us a glimpse into the dark chapters of human history. As conflicts escalated, communities began to build increasingly complex defensive structures. Simple wooden palisades were transformed into a combination of moats, ramparts, and massive gates. The strategic location of villages on hills or rivers provided natural protection, while patrols and signal fires made it possible to quickly warn of an approaching enemy. Despite these measures, the attacks often succeeded because the defenders did not have enough soldiers or weapons at their disposal for long-term resistance. In many cases, however, fortified villages were burned down and their inhabitants killed or taken away. Thus, fortifications were able to slow down the attack, but rarely stopped it completely. Despite the massive decline in the male population, thousands of years ago, its consequences are still evident in the genetic code. Some regions of the world show low variability of the Y chromosome, which is a direct result of ancient selective massacres. This means that a large proportion of men in these regions have a common ancestor from the post-Neolithic population narrowing. Contemporary genetics thus reveals not only the story of the survivors, but also of those whose lineage was broken. Without this drastic intervention, today's humanity would be genetically more diverse, but at the same time it might develop at a different pace and direction. This ancient massacre therefore indirectly influenced the shape of contemporary civilization. Many Neolithic massacres were not only due to personal disputes or a desire for revenge. Economic factors played a crucial role. With the transition to agriculture, food supplies have become a new asset and a prime target for attacks. Crops, stored grain, and herds of domestic animals represented a huge value that could be obtained with a single successful raid. Attackers would often burn fields and slaughter herders to destroy the enemy's livelihoods, forcing them to flee or surrender. In addition, the land acquired was of long-term importance. New settlers could continue farming, use irrigation systems, and benefit from the infrastructure already built. The economic gain was both immediate and permanent, making predatory wars a strategically advantageous, albeit bloody, investment. After the massacres, in which the male population was wiped out almost to the last, there was a dramatic disruption in the balance between the number of men and women. The ratio could be as many as 17 women to 1 man, which had far-reaching social consequences. In such an environment, the role of men became not only reproductively crucial, but also politically powerful, as survivors could influence the future genetic and social organization of the community. This disparity often led to more conflicts, this time between surviving men who competed for mates. As a result, society may have become even more violent, as the struggle over women added another layer of tension to the already existing disputes over land and resources. Although the main cause of the extinction of the male population was targeted killing, the influence of natural factors cannot be ignored. Droughts, crop failures, or sudden climate changes could have triggered famines that weakened entire regions. Exhausted communities were more vulnerable to attacks because they could not maintain strong defenses, and fighters often died not only in battle, but also from malnutrition. Natural disasters could thus act as a trigger for raids. Stronger tribes attacked weakened neighbors to ensure their survival. These events exacerbated the already high levels of violence and accelerated the demographic collapse of the male population. Such drastic events did not disappear without a trace from cultural memory. While direct written records from the Neolithic period do not exist, some myths, legends, and oral traditions may be a distant reflection of these bloody periods. Stories of lost tribes, divine punishments, or heroic battles may actually hide the core truth about real massacres and exterminations. Over time, these stories changed, adding supernatural elements and adapting to the cultural needs of the time. Yet they often retain the motif of mass death, destruction, and selective extermination, which may have originated in the events that scientists are now revealing thanks to genetic and archaeological evidence. The development of trade in the Neolithic brought not only cultural and technological exchange, but also new opportunities for conflict. The routes along which goods were transported became strategic targets because control over them meant access to valuable raw materials, from obsidian and copper to salt and food. Tribes that controlled trade routes could gain power, wealth, and influence, while defeated groups lost access to vital resources. Attacks on trade caravans and ambushes of travelers could quickly escalate into wider wars between communities. In an environment where there were no formal treaties or central authority, power was maintained only by force of arms, leading to further cycles of violence and retaliatory attacks. In response to the growing threat, some communities began to coalesce into larger tribal unions. These alliances could provide greater defense power, resource sharing, and coordinated counterattacks. But alliances were often fragile, based on personal relationships between leaders and temporary coincidences of interests. Once the situation changed, the alliance could fall apart, and former allies quickly turned into enemies. The story of a forgotten prehistoric massacre that nearly wiped out the male population reminds us that human history is not only a story of progress, but of cruelty and survival at all costs. Together, archaeological evidence and genetic evidence paint a picture of a time when war was fought without mercy and when the targeted extermination of men was a strategic tool to control resources, territory, and women. This ancient age shaped not only the genetic composition of today's populations, but also cultural patterns that still appear in various forms today. Today, when human life expectancy has increased and conflict is less frequent in many parts of the world, it is easy to forget how brutal and dangerous the life of our ancestors was. Yet this story reminds us that peace and stability are not a given, but the result of a long and often bloody evolution that we have had to undergo as a species. If you enjoyed this video and want to discover more dark and fascinating chapters of human history, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps me bring you even more interesting content. Thank you.